Welcome to home video assignment number 4. We'll now be focusing on suturing. You'll be performing 4 tasks: simple running suture with 2 different techniques, a horizontal mattress suture, and a vertical mattress suture. There are several ways to hold a needle driver. The first is to put the thumb and the fourth finger through the rings of the instrument and place the index finger on the shaft for additional security and support. Two variations on this technique is either to put just the thumb through the ring or just the fourth finger through the ring. Lastly, you can palm the needle driver, in which case you have no fingers through the rings of the instrument. This allows you to flip the needle driver in your hand, making changing the direction of the needle easier, but it does make the loading and unloading of the needle more difficult. In all cases, the index finger should brace the shaft of the instrument to provide additional stability. Although they are not mutually exclusive, there are 2 basic techniques which are used to drive a needle through tissue. The first technique is called pitch and catch. You pitch the needle by pushing it into the tissue with the needle driver, and then you catch the needle by grabbing it with the forceps and pulling it out of the tissue. Pulling the needle out with forceps can be more traumatic, as it often does not follow the curve of the needle. Therefore, this technique is often reserved for more resilient tissue. The second technique is called push and pull. You push the needle into the tissue with the needle driver, and then you pull the needle out with the needle driver, rotating the wrist to follow the curve of the needle throughout the entire process. The forceps are used only for retraction and exposure. Please note that in order to follow the curve of the needle, as one is pulling the needle out of the tissue, the wrist must start in a pronated position in order to do this properly. The push and pull technique works best when one is palming the instrument, because you have to flip the instrument 180 degrees in order to orient the needle to correctly throw the next stitch. The push and pull technique is being used in this case. As the needle is being pulled out of the tissue, the wrist starts in a supinated position. This requires an over-rotation of the wrist in an awkward position in order to complete the movement. Proper way to pull the needle out of the tissue with the needle driver is to start with your wrist pronated. This allows you to follow the curve of the needle without having to over-rotate your wrist. Unfortunately, the needle ends up facing backwards and requires a rotation of 180 degrees in order to be able to throw another stitch. If you have your fingers in the rings of the instrument, this puts you in an awkward position of having to remove them to flip the needle driver and then put them back in the ring. One way to avoid this is to pull the needle out correctly by starting with the wrist pronated and following the curve of the needle, but then using the forceps to reload and correctly reorient the needle. This example illustrates an awkward over-rotation of the wrist in an attempt to enter the tissue at a 90-degree angle. If you find yourself in this position, you should try to manipulate the tissue to give you a better angle for suturing. By gently pulling up on the tissue and pushing down with the needle, the task is made much simpler. In this example, instead of just rotating the wrist, the needle driver is rotated in the hand. The instrument is held insecurely, and one has to adjust one's grip in order to be able to easily unload the needle. All of this causes excessive lateral movement at the level of the needle, and in turn causes greater tissue trauma. Simple running suture, pitch and catch, time limit 2.5 minutes. For this task, use a foam pad with a 6 cm horizontal incision that has 1 cm hash marks, ½ centimeter away from the edge of the wound. Start with 4 instrument ties, and then use the pitch and catch technique to run the suture. Make sure you take 2 bites to go across the wound. The first focal point of this exercise is to reload the needle on the field. Beginners often reload the needle in the air and do not take advantage of the additional stability provided by resting the needle on the tissue during this task. The second focal point is to use the forceps effectively to manipulate the tissue to optimize your angles for suturing. This means not only just grabbing the tissue, but also pushing down on it as well. Other technical elements that you should pay attention to are the proper handling of the needle driver with the fingers in the rings, the correct reloading of the needle with the wrist supinated after gently pulling the needle out through the tissue with the forceps, and a correct body orientation, which means you should be slightly turned in order to avoid a high elbow position. This will be easiest if you do this task while standing rather than sitting. Lastly, you should complete the task with 4 instrument ties. Simple running suture, push and pull technique. Time limit 2 minutes 30 seconds. The same apparatus is used as previously. A foam pad with a 5 cm horizontal incision that has 1 cm hash marks ½ a centimeter from the edge. 4 knots are tied using the needle driver. The needle driver is held with the palming technique, and the push and pull method is used to drive the needle through the tissue. Focus on grabbing the needle with the wrist pronated and follow the curve of the needle to minimize trauma. Reload the needle while it's still in the tissue, and then flip the needle driver in your hand 180 degrees for the next stitch. Remember not to over-rotate your wrist, and make sure you securely hold the needle driver in your hand by using your index finger to support the shaft of the instrument. Your wrist and the needle driver should rotate as a single unit, and there should be no play of the needle driver within your hand. Vertical mattress suture. Time limit 1 minute 10 seconds. The apparatus you will be using is a foam pad with a 2 cm horizontal incision and an outer mark 1 cm from the edge and an inner mark 2 mm from the edge. The needle is driven through the outer marks in 2 separate bites. The needle is reloaded backwards, and at this point the suture is pulled through to leave a short tail for instrument tying at the end. Then, with the needle loaded backwards, a backhand technique is used to drive the needle through the inner marks. Four instrument tied knots concludes the task. Horizontal mattress suture. Time limit 1 minute.